since 1870. Beyond the economic impact, the pandemic has also presented a range of political, geographical, and cultural implications. Noticeably, the ongoing pandemic has reinforced the power of states and its traditional role as protector of society, as governments globally have been at the forefront of coordinating responses, surveillance and monitoring, and organizing economic relief efforts within and across borders. It has also been observed that most countries are finding it difficult to balance competing interests at both the national and global levels. Governments have been forced to make harsh decisions, prioritizing public security over the economy, with no ideal outcome in most instances. Traditionally, and contradictory in fact, to what we have grown accustomed to since the era of globalization began in the 1980s, we have seen most countries making decisions to promote national interests over global interests in the last few months. Unfortunately, we now live in a hyperconnected world where countries can no longer escape the consequences of the action or inaction of other countries. We have also seen the resurgence of long-time ideological debates concerning issues such as rights and freedoms versus the public good, religion versus science, and idealism versus realism. Among global powers, there has been great anxiety that weakening economies and increased political stability at home will affect chances of re-election and weaken their states' political will and actions against their main rivals in the international realm. Overall, it has been virtually impossible for many global leaders to escape the ambivalent political impact of their policy responses to the pandemic. This is because key policy decisions have become increasingly subjected to multiple competing interests, which must be delicately balanced against each other. Undoubtedly, some global leaders are facing moral dilemmas in which generally accepted policy responses to the pandemic have conflicted with narrow political and fragmented interests and have produced sharp ideological contestations among internal groups and with key external actors. Some of the more extreme elements of these ideological contestations have included the proliferation of conspiracy and fringe theories, xenophobic suspicions and fears, widespread perception of attacks on freedoms, anti-science sentiments, Darwinist ideation, and defiant economic pragmatism. For their economic survival, some countries have been left with a little choice but to reopen their borders to facilitate international trade and travel. Of course, questions about premature reopening amid rising infection rates are valid, but are counterweighted against the necessity of economic survival. Once again, this underscores the idea that policymakers have been faced with very difficult decisions during this period. Indeed, two of the most daunting considerations that have confronted many global leaders universally have been choosing to prioritize either the economy or public health, or indeed, how to balance both. There has been no easy answer to these questions, and countries have largely made very calculated decisions where this issue is concerned, with many opting to use very strict protocols to guide a managed reopening of their economies and their tourism sector. Tourism is particularly vulnerable to adverse geopolitical developments that can engender among potential tourists an adverse disposition towards international travel and an increased fear or suspicion of other cultures, resulting in increasing insularity or narrow-mindedness of people. Additionally, inefficacy at national levels in managing the pandemic can prevent the timely recovery of international tourism or undo gains made in other countries, especially since many countries with both high and low recovery rates have now decided to reopen their borders to each other for international travel. Against this backdrop, the following important questions need to be considered. How will geopolitical developments in major source markets such as the US and China affect the recovery of international tourism? What are the factors that will shape destination attractiveness and tourist preferences in the post-COVID-19 era? Given that tourism is based on the cross-border movement of millions of people, what happens when the incompatible geopolitical values and attitudes of people traveling from and to different regions collide? How can small tourism-dependent economies, especially those in the Caribbean that have done fairly well at containing the pandemic, protect themselves from elevated infection risk originating from major source markets without compromising their fragile economies? Does the Caribbean now need to look to more geopolitically compatible source markets? What will the future of tourism look like for regions such as the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, and Asia? These are some of the compelling questions that I believe we're faced with today, and hopefully the forum this morning, this afternoon, tonight, can give some insights into responses in a timely way. I look forward to the expositions and indeed the gems that will flow from the fertile minds of this very eminent panel. And I look forward to a global response from those who are watching, listening, and are tuned to us throughout the day. The Center stands ready, of course, to be a key player in enabling a better understanding of how this pandemic is impacting global and geopolitical decisions. But more importantly, what the future of tourism could look like post-COVID-19. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bartlett. This event would not be possible without several of our partners, and these include... Thank you very much, Chairman Bartlett. This event would not be possible without the help and the assistance of several of our partners, which include the Tourism Linkages Network, the Tourism Enhancement Fund, Kenyatta University, and the Global Resilience Council. And I'd like to just personally thank them for their assistance in this particular regard. And to bring greetings on behalf of all of our partners, we are going to kindly ask the chairman of the Tourism Linkages Network, Mr. Omar Robinson, to bring greetings at this time. Mr. Robinson?
Thank you very much, Professor Waller. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay, good. Honorable Edmund Bartlett, our Minister of Tourism, Mrs. Dr. Kara Wallace, our Executive Director at the Tourism Enhancement Fund, Mrs. Caroline McDonald-Riley, the Director of the Tourism Linkages Network, our distinguished panelists, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all and welcome. I bring you greetings from both the Jamaica Hotel and Tourist Association and the Knowledge Network of the Tourism Linkages Council, of which I am president and the chairman respectively. It is no secret that tourism economies have been heavily hit by the coronavirus pandemic. We are told that the potential shock could lead to a between 60 to 80% decline in the international tourism economy. What we already know is that the coronavirus has caused tremendous job losses and staggering reductions in tourism revenues. Some economies not too long ago categorized as emerging are now submerged in debt, and traditional tourist destinations are particularly negatively impacted. Travel lockdowns and border closures have resulted in a virtual travel paralysis as we witness the collapse of both domestic and cross-border travel. And of course, with that has come financial devastation of many companies and individuals, including those directly within the tourism sector as well as the allied sectors. The impact of the crisis is being felt throughout the entire tourism ecosystem, and the rebuilding and recovery effort requires a truly collaborative approach nationally and internationally. Hence our gratitude to Minister Bartlett and the Global Resilience Global Resilience Center for today's forum. While the coronavirus has to some extent crippled tourism, arguably one of the most influential, world shaping of human industries, thankfully, we have the type of leadership in place that is helping us to develop recovery measures and restore travel confidence. Colleagues, the coronavirus has not discriminated. States all over the world have been weakened. However, our hope is that we will emerge from this pandemic a more integrated and cooperative world with less geopolitical rivalry and more economic and geopolitical progress. We look to fora like this one to share knowledge and ideas as we collectively work to manage the risks associated with the pandemic and how we reshape the tourism sector of the future into a more resilient and sustainable tourism economy. We look forward to each and every presentation and look forward one day soon to welcoming you all, not virtually, but face to face in Jamaica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson. And apologies, Mr. Robinson is is the chair for the Linkages Network, the Knowledge Network in the Linkages Council. Omar, I had promoted you, and I hope it was speaking it into being. Now we're now ready for the first set of presentations. And just a quick inside joke. I know we're talking about geopolitics, but when you have such a powerhouse of presenters, it is very difficult to decide who presents first. And therefore, that's our own internal politics. So what we did, we decided to go alphabetically. But Ambassador Do is in South Korea, and she's supposed to present second, and we're going to ask if she could present first. So Ambassador? Ambassador Do? Good morning, madam.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you. First, let me congratulate Minister Bartlett that you won the election, and that's very important for a politician to get elected. And congratulations. And having said that, we lived under this very strange atmosphere, environment for past 8 months. And doing that, during 8 months, I've been going through many majors, every morning we wake up, we hear the first report about the day is how many people are infected, how many people are, traced of a coronavirus. So we just became a daily report that we get every day. Having said that, I just want to, if I may, share, because I lived under this circumstance, how Korea handled this, the coronavirus situation. When we first started in month of February, Korea has the largest number of confirmed cases, and we are next door to China. But as we worked very hard, public and private together, by the end of May, only 16 new cases were reported, and then Korea's number of the death for was, I think, about 20%, versus sometimes a very huge amount and huge number of so-called advanced countries. And how did we do that? We did 3 T's. One, very proactive testing, proactive tracing, and proactive treating. And as many experts agree, testing is crucial in combating coronavirus 19 because it is the only way to identify the whereabouts of the otherwise invisible virus, similar to like collecting enemy intelligence in time of war. From its experience, with the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome called MERS in 2015, South Korea, from the very beginning, took two unique stances regarding testing coronavirus 19. Here's how. First, we made testing available and accessible for everyone. It created a vast number of testing sites, including not only big hospitals, but local clinics and health care facilities. And anyone could walk in and free of charge. We didn't charge the testing fee. Also, Korea innovated in ways to minimize physical contact during the test procedure, like drive-through, phone booth testing facilities, which protected both medical staff who are forefront and other patients. These motivated people to voluntarily take the test without fear of getting infected and waiting in queues. Second, more importantly, Korea took proactive measures to test its people without symptoms. That's very critically important through contact tracing. Yes, we did have a social issue. Perhaps it is intruding upon personal privacy, but public accepted that was very important to have contact tracing. And thanks to the fact that 90% of Koreans have mobile phone, we're connected by mobile smartphones, thus creating protective digital blanket, we use this as well. In addition to have every confirmed patient quarantined immediately, the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, using big data, such as cellular data, credit card usage information, and even surveillance camera footage, trace the infected person's steps to locate everyone that he or she had come into direct contact with. All of these contacts were then tested, even if they had no symptoms. That's very important. Even if they had no symptoms, they had to go through testing. Although the other countries have increased their sheer volume of testing, most are limited to reactive testing, that is, testing only people with the symptoms and quarantining them if necessary. Those people likely contracted the virus several days and up to 2 weeks before showing symptoms, and thus would have been in contact with other people, unknowingly spreading the virus. Quarantining an infected person after reactive testing only cuts off future potential ties with other people without considering he or her past interactions. In contrast, proactive testing test everyone who has come into contact with an infected person in order to quarantine a cluster in a network instead of merely an individual with the symptoms. In a sense, the testing cuts off future interactions of both the infected person and his and her past connections. In addition, because the majority of COVID-19 cases are with no symptoms, they go undetected. Proactive testing can identify the silent spreaders of the virus, those who are infected but without symptoms. I think I've said that enough on this. Then there's another two things that really helped with the 3 T's: testing, tracing, and treating. Because in the absence of vaccine or treatment, there are two interventions that can prevent spread of virus: social distancing measures and the use of KF94 face mask. Many countries have carried out aggressive social distancing measures over the past several months, with many imposing a lockdown that allows only for essential functions such as buying food or seeking medical care. These measures have been effective at preventing the spread of virus, flattening the curve. But if the sole objective is to prevent the spread of the virus, then a full lockdown, such as the one implemented in China, is likely the most effective solution. However, a full lockdown has significant economic consequences, as Minister Bartlett and everybody has spoken about. We experienced, and in a democratic society, as open societies as ours, a complete lockdown is very difficult and very unlikely to enforce 100%. This is why the use of KF94 face masks became crucial. Our masks protect not only medical staff, but also other individuals from contracting and spreading the virus. Effective mask can prevent the spread of the virus while not fully shutting down the economy. A public's mass adoption of face masks requires consideration both the demand and the supply side of the economy. On the demand side, it requires people to change their behavior. On the supply side, a country needs to mass produce masks and efficiently distribute them. Koreans were familiar wearing masks from our experience that I told you about 2015 when we were facing masks. And then we have we were used to protect ourselves air pollution. However, late February, when Korea encountered problems with the coronavirus, as the number of confirmed cases skyrocketed, and we found out that mask is a very important way of protecting us. Population demand by 50 million people every mask, and one mask every day. It was not easy at all. So as a result, mask price went up, and sometimes 8 times more than regular price. And to make matters worse, several distributors purposefully suppressed supply to profiteer, further increasing prices. And so government came in. And the government took full control of the production and distribution of face masks. It halted mask exports, rationed, and distributed them through pharmacies so that everyone could obtain a fair and adequate supply. And here comes another private sector contribution, like big conglomerates like Samsung. They provided their cutting-edge technological expertise in upgrading the production capability across all the PPE factories in South Korea. We call this Smart Factory Support Center. This is, again, a good example of good and successful case of public-private partnership. Having said this, as we saw at the very beginning of pandemic, many countries either purposefully or unknowingly kept the whereabouts of virus unclear. Basic information such as number of tests, infection stats were largely withheld from the public. But we did exactly the opposite. We promptly disclosed all the information regarding the virus, information about the location of the infected case, who are and who contacted, and we had 2 daily briefings every day, providing all the information and sending the messages through all mobile phones, and briefings, of course, were led by health and health experts of the government. So now we have come to a point, think how that restart travel tourism. The reason I went along for this explanation how Korea took, not because Korea did well, but this is something very necessary. 3 T's and mask and social distancing. There's 5 things one just has to remember. I don't think there's any other way to overcome this pandemic. Now, I want to talk about this geopolitical situation of this part of the world. Korea is between 2 giant economic giants, right? China and Japan. As of yesterday, China declared that China just completely locked down this coronavirus. Well, it's everybody's wish that could be the same the truth, but the matter of the fact is those people travel from China to Korea. 3 out of 5, when we go through the test, they show that they are infected. So this is something that we have to take it as sort of grain, right? And then Japan announced, actually, International Olympic Committee announced 2021 Tokyo Olympics will be held in July. Why do you think these two countries are doing this? I think they expect the vaccine will be coming to use by the end of 2020 or by 2021. Otherwise, I don't think Japan will come forward this announcement at 2021 there will be Tokyo Olympics. Almost same time as of yesterday, Korea government also announced that by the end of this month, we will have so-called antibody treatment. I think this protocol will be a prelude to the vaccine that we're all talking about by the end of this year or by 2021. Okay, then this is where travel and tourism industry come together and see how we can deal with this coming vaccine, and because if vaccine is owned by a few countries with wealth, like G20 or G8 countries, it won't do as good as far as travel and tourism industry is concerned. So I would like you to draw your attention to two initiatives. One is the UN. I worked with Dr. Mohammed Yunus. A lot of you know him. He was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, laureate, and he proposed a resolution to the United Nations during this General Assembly time on COVID-19 vaccine as a global common good. And already about 150 former presidents, former prime ministers, and really avant-garde thinkers of the world signed up this resolution. And I'm going to do my best that Korea does involve it. Me personally, coming from STEP initiative for the past 20 years with Dr. Rifai, I've been working with him for past 8 years to 12 years. And we know that vaccination, if vaccine is too expensive, people in those areas in Africa and cannot, if they do not have access to the vaccine, I think we can only say half of the game. I don't think our game is complete. That's why I would like to also mention that initiative launched by World Travel and Tourism Council in London, appealing G7 countries plus Australia, Spain, Korea, how to handle this pandemic situation and see whether there is a way we can work together to overcome and see the new light for travel and tourism. And I think we need to, at this time, like Dr. Rifai and Minister Bartlett, we know what the issue is. We have to have some sort of consolidated, united voice to have whole world have access to this vaccination. I think is to arrive soon, and it cannot be just for the people of the rich countries, affluent societies. It has to be. That's why we call it common possession of vaccine. Okay, I think I might have said too long, too many, and it's always good to see all of you. And as Dr. Waller said, that it's almost midnight in Korea. And in Korea, you know, we are fighting the coronavirus. We are asked to sleep early and have a good sleep and good food and good thing. And I have my assistant working with me at this, helping me. So if you allow me, unless you have a question now to me, I'll scoot away and bid good night to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being your usual frank self. Really appreciate it, and I really appreciate the sacrifice that you made tonight to speak to us. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Our minister wants to say something quickly.
I think that you know, the big takeaway from Madam Doe's very, very eloquent presentation is the fact that there has to be this global confluence of involvement that all of us have to share in developing and making available to each other the vaccine and or the technological solutions that we're finding to this pandemic. So the geopolitical reality is that it is now a shared responsibility within the global space to enable an outcome that will be accessible to everyone. Thank you, Madam Doe.
Thank you again, Madam Doe. And I just like to inform our participants that you can send your questions on our social media page, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, as well as the link that was provided for you to access. You can actually also send your questions there, and they'll be asked after the presentation itself. We now move to Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, as well as a board member for the Global Tourism Residence and Crisis Management Center. Professor Beckles, thank you for making yourself available. We know you're a very busy man. The floor is now yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Waller, and all of my distinguished colleagues on the panel. Ambassador Doe has slipped away, but I thank her for laying the foundation for the conversation. Very proud of my colleagues at the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center for putting this engagement together. Very timely dialogue indeed, and very, very important. I congratulate Minister Bartlett for his leadership. I congratulate him on winning the hearts and minds of the Jamaican electorate. But I should say to Minister Bartlett that it is not just in Jamaica that you are loved. You are loved across the Caribbean as our greatest tourism leader, ambassador. You are a step above everyone else. And I know from the work of this center that your reputation transcends the Caribbean and is indeed global. I have never met in my life anyone who has been such an extraordinary ambassador for this industry. And we give thanks and we thank you. The conversation that seeks to bring a relationship between vaccinations and vacations, I think that is really where Ambassador Doe ended, that there has to be a moral relationship between the right to a vacation and the right to a vaccination. And this is all very symbolic indeed. But I wish to depart on the point where she ended by looking at how the Caribbean has been able to very scientifically approach the issue of COVID management and containment, and has achieved significant and very impressive results thus far. This has gone largely unnoticed by the global media. Many countries have been credited for their effective management. The Caribbean has been in the top echelon of that containment success, but we have not seen in the global media the use of the Caribbean as a model, the use of the Caribbean as one of the first successes in this journey. And I can say this. I celebrate the fact that the University of the West Indies of which I am a part, and this center is a part, that we got out there very early in terms of educating our public about this virus and sharing with them the science about this virus at a very, very early stage. And I can say, with some degree of pride, I must say, that the University of the West Indies, as the number one ranked university in the Caribbean, had established a task force to look at this COVID-19 virus long before the first case was reported in the Caribbean. We had been monitoring the situation in China, also East and Southeast Asia. So before the virus was recorded in the Caribbean, we already had assembled our best teams of virologists, of microbiologists, of epidemiologists, and we had put this broad-based task force together to prepare the region, to pull together all of the health ministers, to pull together all of the health practitioners from the community health clinics to the Ministry of Health officials, to the frontline providers, the nurses, the paramedics, that we were already mobilizing this entire community before the virus struck. And there were many seminars that were held on the University of the West Indies TV system, which is a regional system. We had 3 major workshops that broadcast across the entire Caribbean before the first cases were recorded in the region. So it was effectively a relationship between our political leaders, who were very smart in accepting the need to put the science at the forefront of public policy. And it is this alliance between the academia, the researchers, our political leaders, that created the right set of alliances and the right policy postures, so that we were prepared and could brace ourselves and to manage their going forward. So that is something I think we need to foreground. Unfortunately, the Caribbean case, which is one of the finest cases in the world in terms of management containment, has not been given the credit that it deserves within the global media. But that goes on to deal with the second point which I wish to make about globalization. Most of the forces that we are aware of in the world and that we are managing, whether they are viral forces or whether it's the tourism industry, are built on the global agenda. Everything is global. Beyond communications, the concept of tourism. Tourism is one of the most globalized industries in the world, the most deeply globalized industry in terms of domestic culture and behavior. And of course, we therefore need to understand what globalization is. We understand that the reality shows that it is not simply a matter of a level playing field. There is no level playing field in postmodernity. It is the relationship between nationalism and internationalism that the building block, the fundamental building block of globalization is still the nation state. The nation state is where the decisions are fundamentally taken, though we recognize that those decisions do have an implication for global application and implementation. Tourism is located precisely at the center of what might seem to be a contest between the economics of globalization and the politics of nationalism. And the tourism might very well be at the intersection of this, where nations are making policy decisions within the context of an industry that is deeply global. And therefore, the dialectical relationship between how a nation is seeking to handle its own circumstance in terms of public health protocols, but realizing that success can only be made at the global level, therein lies that specific tension that we are looking at. So we know the economics, and we have seen the economics. I mean, the World Trade Organization has announced that over $300 billion have been lost in revenue from the global tourism sector. This is 3 times greater than the negative impact of the 2008-2009 economic recession. So this is 2008-2009 writ large 300%. So that gives us all the dimensions, and we have seen reported across the global landscape a 90% drop in the movement of persons who are classified as tourists. So we are looking really at a meltdown in the global tourism sector, but it is triggering economic decline and a movement towards global recession in its wake. So this is really an existential threat that we are focusing on, and young nations, small nations, nations that are emerging in the developed nation state category, nations that are trying to put underdevelopment and poverty behind them and are moving into the global space with a dynamic sense of their economic potential. These nations with the least reserves to get themselves through this are the ones who are mostly impacted. And the Caribbean is in one of those special zones. The Caribbean space is not only one of the most globalized parts of the world, and one might very well argue that it is in the Caribbean that globalization was invented, because the whole world came into the Caribbean over that colonial period to create the Caribbean as a global space. So it is deeply penetrated in terms of global economics. It is dependent almost entirely, and when we speak of entirely, we are speaking of 75% of the Caribbean economy is built around this sector. That gives it almost a monopoly status within our economies, thus the depth of our dependency. The fact that we are small island nation states with special peculiarities is also impacting our tourism sector. But importantly, we are open to other vulnerabilities. While our tourism industry has suffered this meltdown and therefore its fiscal impact on all of our economies, we are also in the climate change catastrophe. And the global climate change has also exposed the Caribbean, through no fault of its own, to the ravages of rising sea temperatures, global temperatures, the disappearance of beaches in some societies, the impact on our marine life, the impact on that entire ecosystem that we associate with the traditional Caribbean tourism model. So we have climate change. And now we have COVID-19. In addition to this, we are dealing with the historical issues around chronic diseases. Again, legacies of our history, legacies of our vulnerability, and now we can speak in terms of the 3 C's, the devastation, the COVID-19, the climate change, the chronic diseases, creating a cocktail that is affecting the sustainability of our Caribbean economies and societies. So the Caribbean now, because it is in the deepest end of this catastrophe, has to develop strategies to emerge from that depth. This is going to be extremely difficult, but the Caribbean is a highly motivated place because it is sensitive to its vulnerability, and it will produce the energy that is required at this stage to emerge going forward. But we in the Caribbean to look very closely at what the tourism industry is all about. And sometimes we might have to put the cart before the horse. What do I mean by this? The tourism industry is built upon the foundations that in a culture of world peace, in a country of the stabilization of civilizations where everyone is respectful of everyone, where the concept of freedom, freedom of the human being to enjoy life, to meet with your neighbor and your distant neighbor, to interact and engage, to create a world of civility, to create a world in which the highest level of humanity is allowed to flourish. That is what tourism is all about. And that is what we have to protect. And that is why in the Caribbean, we have put ourselves at the center of movements like reparatory justice for the history of oppression. Because what we are saying is that we in the Caribbean have a deep endemic to interact along the lines of freedom. That is the world that will allow the tourism industry to flourish. And that is the world that we in the Caribbean are investing in. That's the kind of world we are investing in, because that is the world that would allow tourism to thrive and allow, therefore, the Caribbean economies to demonstrate their role as one of the freest parts of the world, as one of the most humane cultures, as one of the most multiracial cultures in the world, where the races and cultures interact in peace and with love for each other. That is Caribbean culture, and that is the culture we are committed to, because within that system, tourism will thrive and will rise. So when we speak, therefore, of the way forward, we are not just speaking of the tourism products. We will have to speak about innovation. We will have to speak that the old model, which is under tremendous stress within the concept of the public health protocols, the old model is under stress, and therefore we have to be innovative. Again, we congratulate Jamaica for reviewing the traditional model, for looking for ways to innovate that model to make it relevant to a post-COVID environment. But we are committed to the multi-dimensional approach of world peace, world freedom, new tourism products, new access to value to allow this industry to have its greatest impact. My suggestion is that this is the time to go beyond bilaterals. I know that many countries are developing bilateral relationships to enable each other to function in mutually agreed bilateral arrangements to allow citizens to move. And we will become very sophisticated at working these bilaterals. The region of the Caribbean, which is made up of multiple nation states, have already put that system in place when we are conceptualizing the Caribbean as a bubble. The Caribbean as one space, and therefore we have to look at each other within the context of our respective efficiency in the management of the spread of the virus. But I think we have to move on to a multilateral solution, a multilateral engagement. My sense is that we need a global tourism summit based on the foundation that only multilateralism can lay the foundation for effective recovery of this sector, where heads of government are prepared to sit to discuss the geopolitics, the fact that there will be no economic growth without the growth of the tourism sector, and that we can do this on a hemispheric basis, even as we build the blocks for that global summit, where a policy dialogue can take place around the key fundamental issues. Again, this will be a test of what globalization really is, whether there is truly a globalization at the level of international policy, or whether we are simply speaking of the merger of multiple nationalisms into a network. A tourism sector where heads of states, education and health ministers, as well as the leadership of our tourism ministers, can begin this conversation to show the importance of this industry to the world economy and the importance of this industry to world peace. Having economic growth without world peace will also undermine the recovery process. So therefore, we have to speak dialectically of economic recovery and increasing senses of world peace and global tolerance. We do not wish to see economic growth creating totalitarian states where human freedom is not celebrated. That would undermine the very success that we are dedicating ourselves to. So, there is therefore the need for that global dialogue. There is therefore the need within that context to create the ethics of what Madame Dole spoke about, which is to ensure that there is a scientific discovery around vaccinations that goes into an ethical discourse about human access equally to these scientific innovations. The world will wish to rediscover itself. After 2 years of this COVID, the world will want to rediscover itself. The visitor with a new vision. The visitor now more sensitive than ever to the freedom of tourism, more sensitive than ever of the value of being able to enter another society, explore, discover, and strengthen yourself. There is going to be the emergence of a new philosophy of tourism at the level of the individual, a new sensitivity, a new set of values, driving again notions of respect, notions of tolerance. And therefore, we must prepare ourselves. And the way to prepare is to drill that tourism product into the full matrix of your nation. So it is not just on the margin of the beaches. It is not in the environment of the marine culture. But the new and innovative tourism products will be in the agri-culture. It will be in the education culture, where people travel for education, for professional training, for events, for conferences, for workshops. It's the edu-culture that is going to be also sucking in that visitor. It is going to be the sport culture, where art, entertainment, and sport are co-joined to produce a value of the spectacle of the experience, where we all want to bring people to move around the world to enjoy these gifts of the world. The art, the culture, the entertainment. All of the expressions of a national value should have the capacity for sharing. These things are not simply for the citizen within. The best of what we do are to be shared with the world as part of our humanity. And that is also the new foundation for a tourism product. Nation develops and share. The impact of the visitor will also be important, because as the visitor enters and participates in these new areas of national endeavor, that too will create a dynamic that will drive quality, that will drive sophistication, that will drive elegance. So it is going to be the interaction of the citizen and the visitor that will create the refinement of the product. Because we cannot be that arrogant to assume that we can achieve the highest levels of sophistication and value by ourselves. It has always been in history. It has always been the interface of the native and the visitor at their respectful that generates the sophistication to move a society forward. So these are the multidimensional aspects of this process. But I'm calling for a segmented, a hemispheric, segmented, but global summit to look at this matter and to ask our ministers of tourism to continue to make the point. It's not simply directly, immediately about economic recovery. It's about creating the global ecosystem to enable that recovery to take place. And by having this global summit, we recognize that this is an industry, this is an economy that will thrive in the context of human tolerance, of freedom and mutual respect, and the overall contribution in this 21st century world peace. World peace is the runway on which that airplane will land and take off. World peace. And that in the background is where we are committed. So I wish to end there. I know my time has come to an end, and I thank you, colleagues, for the generosity and the tolerance of your willingness to hear me this morning. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. Excellent President. Excellent, insightful, innovative, and very thoughtful as well. Thank you very much. I'm pretty much sure that there will be discussions about this summit that you are interested in having, and certainly, you know, the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center would love to partner with the University of the West Indies on this particular initiative. We will now have Professor James Congo. Professor Congo is the Executive Director of the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center, located at the Kenyatta University in Africa. Professor Congo, the floor is yours. Sorry, Professor Congo, could you please turn on your mic? Prof, could you turn on the mic, please?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope you can be able to hear me now.
Oh, okay. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, let me take this opportunity to join Ambassador Yang Shimdong in congratulating Honorable Edmund Bartlett, the Minister for Tourism in Jamaica, for winning the just ended election. And I can say also, I can join Professor Hillary in saying that we have noticed your commitment in promoting tourism in the world. Otherwise, I will try to focus on the geopolitics and the coronavirus implication for global travel and tourism in the continent of Africa. And it became very interesting when you try to look at what I'm sorry, I hope that somebody can be able to push the slide forward for me, because the connection is not very good for my phone. Thank you. I can say that when you look at tourism in the continent of Africa, you can be able to see that this is a very, very important, very important. We know that by last year, in 2019, we had about 1.5 billion tourists that moved around the world. And out of this number, Africa was able to receive about 71 million tourists who brought a total earning of more than 38 billion US dollars. And before the COVID-19, Africa was the second fastest growing region for tourism in the world. And the tourism sector contribute about 4.4% of the GDP of Africa. And it also contribute about 21.5% of service export. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we know that 1 out of 20 jobs in the continent can be found in the travel and tourism sector. The role, you can go to the next page, please. The role of tourism, as far as the GDP of the continent is concerned, varies in different countries. In about 12 countries, you find that the tourism sector contribute 10 to 24% of their GDP. And many governments relies on the tourism for contributing to get their revenues and also in the creation of employment. You can go ahead, please. But we know that when COVID-19 hit the world early this year, many African countries were so affected and they reacted fast. One, they ended up closing their borders and they used the protocols from the past to be able to roll out how to handle the COVID-19. And by July this year, it was reported that 90% of the safari operators had witnessed about 75% or more decrease in both booking, request, actual booking due to COVID-19. WTTC estimates that the continent is going to lose about 53 billion of its GDP, and in the worst scenario, this can go up to 120 billion. We know the aviation-related industries, we have been having a lot of job losses, and this is estimated that it could reach about 3.5 million people, and this is out of the 6.2 million people that are employed in the aviation industry. And the full year traffic is expected to plummet by about 54%. This means affecting more than 8 million passengers when we compare these to last year. Next slide, please. And when we talk about the geopolitics, in Africa, China, the US, and Europe, they are the largest generating markets for African tourism. But you already know that these countries are also among the hardest hit when it comes to coronavirus. And what is happening in the continent is that many countries, they have started a phased reopening of whether it is the sea, whether it is land or air. And this happened just last month, the month of August. And if we can look, next slide, if we can look at the geopolitics of coronavirus, we know that they are the driving forces. And coronavirus itself has put globalization under siege. It has halted travel to anywhere in the world. The outbreak of coronavirus has affected the global flow of goods and services. And the pandemic is now forcing all nations to look inward, speeding the process of deglobalization. I want to say that when you look at the geopolitics, we know that geopolitics is the expression of the act of power. Tourism itself, we normally know it is an expression of freedom, which tends to increasingly conditioned by these power games. And when you look at how the coronavirus is affecting the geopolitics of different countries in Africa, we know that apart from applying brakes on the GDP growth, the virus itself is also affecting the key macroeconomics indicators, whether we are talking about the oil prices and even in the interest rate. Want to say that Africa, after seeing some of these challenges, has come up with coping strategies in different countries. We know countries have been allocating risks to tourism and travel sector. There are others that are enacting tax break for industrial and tourism businesses. We have also other countries where we are seeing the reduction of cost of electricity and natural gas. Others are also cutting the interest rates so that the tourism and travel industry can be able to survive. We are also seeing cases where governments, they are providing grants to seasonal workers, especially those who are involved in the travel and tour industries. We are also seeing increasing cash transfer payment to poor households in some countries and an increasing unemployment benefit. And in a number of countries, we realize that they are providing targeted support to specific sectors. Next page. And therefore, we ask ourselves as a continent, what is the way forward? Or what is the way forward for Africa under these difficult circumstances of COVID-19? I want to say, and I want to suggest, that there is need to demolish the barriers for visas among African countries. Immediately this is done, it is going to promote tourists, whether it is local tourists, regional tourists, or even other tourists from other countries. This was already experienced in a country like Morocco, when they were able to demolish the barriers for visas for tourists from China. They were able to get about 350% increase of Chinese visiting Morocco. And no wonder that is why you find that Morocco, every year, like last year, they got more than 12 million tourists visiting their country. There is also need for our continent, African continent, to continue promoting innovation and technology. I have seen this one happening in many countries, including my own country, Kenya, where our Minister for Tourism is in the forefront in promoting innovation and technology in the tourist sector. And we can say that we are seeing the country reaping the benefit for that. Where we are also seeing that many countries, especially in Africa, we are now seeing a situation where even virtual tourism is being promoted. There is also need to promote travel facilitation, increasing enhanced connectivity and tourism visa policies, especially when it comes to people traveling within the continent. It's unfortunate that sometimes for one to travel to some of the countries, you need to travel fast outside the continent so that you can be able to visit the country. There is also need for us to foster resilience. And this can be done through promoting safety and security and crisis communication. It is a high time for the continent to advocate and promote Blood Africa. Next slide, please. We are also saying that for tourism to be in a position travel and tourism to be in a position to be where it was, like last year. There is need to champion integrated forward-looking tourism policies. We need to promote domestic and regional tourism. We know that the population of Africa, we are more than 1.3 billion people. But we are talking about, if we look at the number of tourists that visited the continent last year, it was about 71 million, a very small percentage. But if we can be able to promote regional tourism, we promote domestic tourism. I have seen in my own country, Kenya, that when there is a challenge, it is the domestic tourism that usually put our hotels and even the travel agencies. They are the ones that sustain it during the time of challenges and calamities, like what we are having now. We are seeing, like in the country now, a number of domestic tourists visiting different sites in the country. And we are saying the future of tourism in Africa, especially after this COVID-19, lies in domestic and regional tourism. We are also seeing pairing tourism businesses for the digital future. Next slide, please. I want to say, and quoting Secretary General Sulapolo Kasfi of the United Nations World Travel Organization, Secretary General, he said that there is need for coordinated protocols and procedures between government, private sector, and communities on border management, air transportation, hospitality, travel agencies, events, and attractions. If we are going to revive tourism, after experiencing these challenges of COVID-19, then we need coordinated protocols and procedures between our governments, between our private sector, between communities, and even when it comes to border management. As the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, that tourism can be a platform for overcoming the pandemic. This is by bringing people together. Tourism can promote solidarity and trust, crucial ingredients in advancing the global cooperation that is so urgently needed, especially at this time. And therefore, the aspect of geopolitics, we are saying, if we look at the role of tourism, it can be in a position to bring people together. When the tourists move aloud, like now we know the challenges that is there in the world between China and the US, especially they have been competing in trying to control many things in the world. We are saying tourism itself, it can help us. It can play a great role in bringing our people together. It can play a very significant role in promoting solidarity and trust. It can play a very important role in advancing the global cooperation that we so urgently need at this particular time. And we are also saying that if we are to move forward, then we need to look at the aspect of geopolitics And I can say that there are more main aspects that characterize Africa's geopolitics. One of these is fragmentation and disparities between subregions, as well as between countries and between zones within the same country. We're also saying that the other geopolitics affecting our continent is the interstate conflict. We know a few years ago, we had a number of armed conflict. If you look at some like year 2008, we know that out of the 345 armed conflict that were reported in the world, Africa had its own share of more than 70 conflicts. Then there is the geopolitics of foreign covetousness. And we have seen this, especially when it comes to a number of countries where there is foreign covetousness, maybe because, especially because of the natural resources. We know the continent of Africa has a lot of natural resources, whether we are talking about minerals, whether we are talking about agricultural land, fertile agricultural land. We know there is a lot in the continent. And there is the foreign covetousness. And we have seen that this one many a time leads to promoting sometimes conflict, so that as people are busy in a conflict, there are others who are busy taking away the resources. And therefore, we have to look at, and I can say one thing that is so much needed in Africa is the need for continuous research on our integration and cooperation among the different countries. We also need always to carry out research so that it can inform especially makers as they come up with their decisions. Next slide, please. Otherwise, I had been told that I was to spare 10 minutes. And let me say, when I look at the continent, I can say there is light at the end of the tunnel of this COVID-19. God has been so gracious to our continent that we have reported quite a small percentage of death relating to COVID-19. I know there are many people who have been wondering what has happened, but I always say that God has been on our side. Otherwise, in Kenya, in East Africa, we say, Asante Sana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your insightful, powerful, and hopeful conversation from our sister center at the Kenyatta University in Africa. We now are going to ask Professor Lee Miles, Professor of Disaster and Crisis Management at the Beaumont University, as well as a member of the board for the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center, to present next. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Waller. Can you all hear me okay? Jolly
Yes,
good, I presume you can. Okay, so thank you very much. I've been asked to speak a little bit on the European perspectives, and I want to actually draw out some of the themes that have been spoken about. So I'm going to really talk in four parts and try to be focused in terms of making the linkage with previous speakers. So I wanted to start really by saying that what has been the experience of Europe with COVID-19, and in particular its implications for geopolitics and for the travel and tourism perspective. And I think I really want to start really with five main observations really. The first main observation is broadly the theme that if you were to look at the European perspective, I mean, the fundamental point is it's really been adaptive working with very strong geopolitical influences. So adaptive working with very strong geopolitical influences has been really the main observation as the way Europe has dealt with it. But the question comes, has Europe dealt with it very well? And I think the important point to argue here is that to just quote some very short figures at you as always, from the European Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, as of the 8th of September, in other words, some few days ago, there were just over 2.4 million cases has been reported in the EU and the European Economic Area Zone plus the UK. And of those, 1.7 million of those 2.4 million cases had actually been prevalent in the 5 large states in Europe, that being Spain, the UK, France, Italy, and much further down the line, Germany. So what I'm basically saying here is that to reinforce the point made by both Professor Waller, the Minister Bartlett, and the Vice Chancellor, it's very much a state-centric picture, actually dominated by big state actions, and I would argue in many ways big state mistakes. So in terms of how we look at testing, equally if we talk about deaths, then something like 183,000 deaths in Europe since, as of the 8th of September since the outbreak, across the EU and the EA and the UK. These are EU and UK figures. But of those, again, of those 183,000, 144,000 of them were in those top 5 states again, in the UK, in Italy, in France, in Spain, and in Germany. So again, it's a state-centric picture dominated by trying also to monitor each other's curves and waves and impacts. And one of the prevalent features is how Eurocentric the debate has largely become, where actually, for example, in the UK, there's very much a watch as to how far Spain or Italy are, or in our case, France, most recently, are in front of the UK and in terms of the way forwards. But of course, the other important point is that in the European perspective is that we're also talking about rising awareness of a second wave being emerging. So serious outbreaks in Spain, France, Italy, and the UK, and all on the way to really very strong second waves, many people suspect. And that is worrying because, of course, we also have the flu and winter, the winter flu season here across Europe. Now, why have I mentioned those aspects? Well, really reinforces some of the points that in the European context, that one of the distinctive features is that really COVID-19 was also a distinctive because it was largely something that affected Europe. And in many ways, Europe had been in one of the major areas in terms of contagion and, of course, disease spread. And that was different from perspectives to do with, for example, Ebola, SARS or MERS. So, for example, where it largely be seen as being an issue of a pandemic that was far away, of which the state-centric approaches were actually about how to deal with the foreign impact. Whereas actually, we're talking about actually being very much a first world scenario for Europe and really on its doorstep. Therefore, it's not surprising that this leads to 3 observations. The first is that it has required highly responsive and timely national decision making. The point being that the state has been central, as the Vice Chancellor talked about, to the way we deal with globalised threats, and be it COVID, climate change, or different types of diseases. But those new measures are also something that have not been seen before. So we were really adapting plans. Maybe we were fortunate in Europe to have some pandemic plans, but largely many of those were found wanting. So it's really been working and adapting prior plans through really a case of trial and error. And that has meant, not surprisingly, that not only have we focused on state-centric solutions, but also a very European state-centric perspective. And that, of course, has been to the cost of the tourism and travel industry to some extent, as the global focus has moved away. So the theme I'm arguing here in terms of the observations from Europe is really to reinforce the point made by Minister Bartlett, that effectively we've gone into a more insular perspective in which many of the traditional strong global players, being in Europe, have not really been that globalized in terms of pushing forward debates, as I would argue as a professor in the Disaster Management Centre. They've been very much focusing on the local within the global, let's put it that way. And that's not surprising because this is down to geopolitics, and really to reiterate some of the themes made in the conference itself. Geopolitics has really been a central feature of the debates in COVID-19 in Europe, I would argue. Some, for example, talk about the trimming of the globalization as a dominant narrative. And importantly, in the European context, the impact of COVID has not just had an impact on the globalization narrative, but in particular on the free movement of people narrative. And what I mean by that is that the previous speaker from Africa, the professor there, talked about that in many ways globalization was and tourism was a freedom of expression. But actually globalization through COVID has been seen as being trimming particularly free movement of people as a way of actually dealing with this. And why is that important? Well, it means that the European debates in governments have actually been influenced by three major elements. The first, you could argue, is that it's tended to lead to less permissive attitudes toward free movement in general. The COVID had reinforced a debate that was going on in Europe about the impact of free movement. And that is a negative thing for travel and tourism, one would argue. I'm talking about in a general sense. In the UK, of course, it has reinforced some of the assertions made about Brexit, for tighter borders, and for restrictions on migration. Second aspect, you could argue, is that COVID dispersal, the spread of COVID, has also been associated, interwoven into debates about being a byproduct of a migration crisis, which is affecting Europe. That actually, effectively, free movement and COVID are interlinked, and migration has become, in many ways, a highly contextualized and contested issue in Europe, the European context. And the third element is that, in many ways, particularly in relation to tourism, is that issues of globalization and free movement of people had now become really a way of bean counting. And what I mean by that is that it becomes an issue of COVID-19 non-compliance. So we see in European press and UK presses regularly every day about how the number of specific COVID cases that are coming in on planes from resorts or from airlines. So in a sense, we've become also scientificized, if you like, if we can use that kind of made up expression, or in many ways a better way of identifying. So in a sense, the debate has become very micro as well in the way that it's had. And the way I'm stressing all these elements from the European perspective is that it has led to what Minister Bartlett and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Windsor were really striking at, which is actually that the nation-state-centric decision-making has been dominated by traditional geopolitical thinking and, to some extent, about the role of the state. Now, to some extent, when we talk about COVID-19, that's not surprising. Why? Because health capacity is largely seen as being within the domain of national government expenditure, national government provision, and national government planning. It's not surprising then that pandemics in particular tend to lead to a more state-centric approach, and in many ways an existential threat on the state through the health system in particular. So it's not surprising then that the state should and has rightly been quite largely involved in this. But what it has done is reinforce the state perspective that it should play a directional role. You could argue that in many ways that travel and tourism has been dominated not just by freedom, but by a free spirit in which the private sector has been a dominant player in pushing forward growth. And ministries have been, ministers like Minister Bartlett, have been instrumental in allowing the private sector to grow and to develop. And in many ways, what we see actually is that in many ways, the focus on the health dimension actually leads to a more restrictive view of this from many of the states in Europe about to what extent this permissive attitude should be adopted. It also becomes linked to wider state-centric issues, and the African professor talked particularly about the important point about geopolitics and strategic conflict. And it's not surprising that in the moment in Europe, there's also a major existential threat between Greece and Turkey, which is partly related to about territorial waters, and in a sense becomes immersed as another level in this wider debate about being very European focused about COVID-19 and about globalization. Now, all I've done there is to illustrate why Europe has become more European focused, and in my view, it's a mistake, and not surprisingly. But also, I think it leads to one very also important point. It has led in many ways to a less caring and perhaps simply a level of awareness of the wider challenges outside Europe and in the developing world. Since COVID-19 has been very much seen as in many ways a first world problem inside Europe, which you have to deal with the cases which are inside Europe, and secondary about dealing with the free movement of people coming in as travel and tourism coming through. So what I'm arguing here is that there's a propensity in many ways for a tension to develop between what Europe and the European states are seen as being good COVID action by governments and their general propensity to be involved in development, in sustainable development, and indeed in aid agendas, which is not necessarily a good thing. Very much, in many ways, almost a de facto European first perspective has started to blow up from the bottom upwards. And I want to just bring this forward to say, if anything, it's also reinforced COVID-19 and the impact on travel and tourism has tended to reinforce existing fault lines within European states. So if you take the case of the UK, one of the major challenges is about how we deal with specific issues like travel corridors. And there's been even more of a localised tension between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, who haven't even been able to agree common positions on which states and which travel corridor protocols should apply at particular times. And that illustrates how, in many ways, the insularity has become even further down inside some of the European states. And to illustrate that further, this has also become localized in the way European states look at other European countries. So in practice at the moment, there's a focus about should we focus on particular regions within countries about travel corridors rather than entire states. And of course, most recently, the UK now has 7 Greek islands where it has restrictions, but not on Greece itself. So here's an illustration of all those tensions. Now, what this means is that all this has done is to reinforce and in many ways, for me, decapitate one of the major players on the globalization agenda, which you would see perhaps in climate change, which has been many of the European states. I can say that as a professor, there are many European governments that would disagree, but what we would say is it's been very much a focus on those elements. Now, I want to end by really, what does this mean for the travel and tourism industry? What do these geopolitical forces mean for when we talk about travel and tourism? And I think it really has focused that the geopolitical implications for tourism management have really focused in many ways on 4 or 5 areas. Firstly, about the management of inclusion or travel corridors and exclusion zones. So the imposition of travel corridors has become in many ways the central media event as to how travel and tourism will be dealt with and how that affects relations between states. So in many ways, even the way we are managing the travel and tourism industry is done through, as the Vice Chancellor from West Indies talked, bilateral bubbles or bubbles within an intra-European affair. And I would argue in practice that actually the travel corridors have tended to focus on short-term European travel, actually. So it has actually been very much focused on facilitating travel corridors with other European corridors, which in many ways has actually also reinforced this challenging debate about we need to be more global. We need to get our head up to deal with the bigger issues. So in many ways, the travel corridor issue in Europe has actually led in many ways to an even greater European regional bubble discussion about how do we facilitate travel and tourism and travel between European states, much to the chagrin of many travel and policymakers. But what this means in many ways is that the long haul markets where you are actually becoming more and more challenging and in many ways aren't even featuring strongly in the European debates on travel corridors. At least in the media and public level. And this also leads to a second point about quarantine rules and border controls. I would argue that they've even become more localized about actually treating quite correctly quarantine rules should affect particular regions. And that means also that not only do you have a stronger state perspective, but you've also seen a stronger regional, subnational perspective developing within that. And I've talked about that in a moment, so I won't go into that in greater detail. But this has also meant that a third major issue for Europe, in many ways where the contention has also been about data collection. There's been huge variation across Europe on testing and on tracing and in many ways on treatment. But particularly on testing and tracing, there have been these major variations between when testing was brought in, the level of universality of testing, the comprehensive nature of it, and in practice, whether states are being penalised when they test more and their figures are actually more responsive to changes in travel and tourism. So it's been very much about moving away from the R range of how we deal with infection in COVID to positivity ranges. We shouldn't punish those states that are being very effective in their implementation of various elements of testing and tracing. And of course, the ambassador at the start in Korea talked particularly also about the importance of having an effective tracing system. And in the UK context, this has been something of a controversial area, to say the least. So in many ways, the division and lack of consensus about testing and tracing, about models and so forth in Europe has actually tended to reinforce the uncertainty about travel and tourism as a sector in relation to that. And it's also meant that we found that a major challenge in Europe, which is of course the imposition of new systems requiring universal dissemination and exposure. Not even having some common implementation of social distancing and the use of face masks across Europe and across the European states for some time. So here's an illustration about really some of the contestation that has taken place that affects the geopolitics. But I want to end now in my last 4 minutes by actually reinforcing this. Well, what does it actually mean? I haven't talked about the economic implications, but really for me, there are in many ways 3 or 4 major economic observations which we are all well aware of. In the European context, we see exactly the same, where state economic policies are becoming more protectionist and more interventionist, and travel and tourism is increasingly seen as being something that is on state life support, basically, in which the public sector is both driving the sector and supporting the sector. Now, the danger of this in the European context is to take the point that the Vice-Chancellor was talking about strongly, where travel and tourism, which was traditionally seen as being a growth and money spinning area, as something of continual growth and a real winner, is now increasingly seen with more dubious eyes by governments in Europe, simply because of the costs involved in that. I know that's a controversial statement, but what it means is that the branding and the narrative of the new normal of COVID-19 has really had a negative impact, particularly on travel and tourism, and this idea of it being a constant growth sector. It also means that in practice, we might be talking about actually focusing on different types of generations. And I know Minister Bartlett and others have talked about focusing on Generation X rather than other elements in the way that about the future growth. But really, we should also talk about actually, do we need different types of policies in Europe to allow for effectively the free movement of younger people, where we might have more cases but less deaths, as opposed to other areas of the sector. Now, in practice, what we're talking about is that we may need a much more nuanced implementation strategies to be able to deal with these. But these have to be discussed globally, not just within particular ministries of a particular government in Europe. And that reinforces the idea. But I would also argue in practice that this idea of travel and tourism as being a constant growth area is something that in the longer term may be rectified, but really we need to understand that there's a new normal around travel and tourism, and the way European governments are increasingly seeing that, which is a narrative that may be increasingly starting, and that has challenges for the sector that they need to address. But it also means that it also has important aspects, because I'm a disaster management perspective, and to make the point, the linkages, the challenges between different types of hazards are also becoming much more effective because of climate change. So in practice, as we talk about, even in the Caribbean, the impact of a hurricane season in a COVID-19 environment is something that has to be built in. So in many ways, we're not just talking about the travel and tourism dollar, we're also talking about the resilient branding dollar that needs to be there to support that travel and tourism sector. So I'm going to end with 3 reflections. My first reflection is that we also need to be very clear that we are moving into a second wave. And in my view, in practice, we are not talking about, we need to move the debate away from treating this as waiting and seeing until after the pandemic has gone, to really maybe facing the reality that in parts of the world and in parts of our traditional travel and tourism areas, COVID-19 and mutations of it in the future may actually become part of an endemic residual environment. And that in practice, that means we need to think about how we balance that resilience argument and the safety of tourists with this constant need for the growth of the sector. So in practice, this means that we also need to protect the local populations, and therefore Europe needs to also wake up to the fact that European travel and tourists may not necessarily be as popular or as welcome in other parts of the world as before, simply because of the challenge of being COVID-19 transmission areas themselves. So I'm going to end by really making that reflection, which is to say, basically, we need very clearly for the ministers of tourism in particular to get together in a summit framework to be able to really strongly outline what is the new normal frameworks at the global level that we need. We need more and more global norms. And in many ways, the Caribbean has been at the heart of establishing that. A new normal framework in which we are talking about travel and tourism, in my view, in an endemic COVID world, as opposed to one where we wait and see until after a pandemic has gone. In many ways, we got caught out across the travel and tourism sector by an underestimation of the impact that pandemic can have on the sector. And that means in practice, we need to be very, very clear about that. So in many ways, what I'm talking about here is to reinforce the point made by the Vice-Chancellor, that I would argue that there needs to be a very strong summit meeting, in many ways much close to the idea that the Rio was in 1992 in relation to climate change, in which the narrative around the new normal of the travel and tourism sector, as defined by ministers of tourism and others globally, is brought truly to the forefront. Without that stabilisation, what are the global norms? Then some of the global players, like Europe, like the United States, like China, may continue to have a more insular view than this global strategy needs to be. So in end, I would argue that COVID-19 is not just a wake-up call for travel and tourism about pandemics now and in the future. It is actually, in many ways, I would argue, a call to arms for tourism ministers to come together globally to discuss the implications of the new normal for global assertions around travel and tourism. In many ways, to reinforce the point that we need to reinsert what is globally acceptable to maintain a prosperous travel and tourism industry in a COVID-19 environment that may be around much longer than we may like. I'll end there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Miles, for your usual brilliant lecture. We're now going to ask Dr. Talib Rafai, the previous Secretary General for the United Nations World Tourism Organization and our co-chair for the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center. Dr. Rafai, I should also mention that he's also a co-chair for the Global Resilience Council. Dr. Rafai, over to you. Dr. Rafai, we're going to ask if you could unmute your mic, please. Okay. Okay, 1 second. All right. While we wait to get back, while we wait for Dr. Rafai to return, I have some questions here that I'd like to throw out to the panelists. The first question essentially asks whether the internal politics in the United States, in Russia, as well as in China, has had an impact on the coronavirus globally, and generally speaking, and more specifically, how has that... Oh, Dr. Rafai? Oh, and how has that affected the tourism sector in your region? So, I mean, anyone can answer that question. Is Professor Miles? Oh, sorry, I'm getting Talib. Dr. Rafai? He's speaking.
Yes. Hello.
Okay, excellent.
My
Dr.
voice,
Rafai, you may start. Great.
Okay,
Yes, we're
thank
hearing
you.
you now. Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm sorry to have had these technical problems. Never had them before. Let me start by congratulating also Minister Ed for three reasons, really. Edmund, first of all, congratulations on the winning of the elections. I'd say what the Vice Provost said, you won the hearts and the minds of the people of Jamaica. You deserve it, truly do. But the second thing I want to congratulate you on is putting us together in this wonderful, wonderful meeting. The third thing is, you're truly the best, truly. I mean, when you won this award of Best Tourism Minister, that was no joke. It was real. I can't say much because I'm a good friend, and whatever I say is biased. So thank you so much again, Mr. Bartlett. I want to start my talk by saying that in Chinese, you know, the word crisis and the word opportunity are one word. They don't use two different words, which means that we have to look for the opportunities coming out of each crisis. I see great opportunities coming out of this crisis. I'm supposed to be talking about the Middle East, but I must start by talking about a bit of the international scene first, and then I'll come back and focus on the Middle East a bit, if I may. The opportunities coming out of the crisis. Now, there's a new world order that's in the making. I was very impressed by the presentation of the Vice Chancellor. I would love to have a copy of it, please. All your presentations are excellent, but Vice Chancellor, you spoke outside our realm, from outside the tourism club, which makes your talk even more valuable to us, because we have this habit of speaking only to ourselves. We need to speak outside of the box, think outside of the box. You've done that. Government has taken control of everything now. They have become really the focus of everything. It's gone down to the basic of each national state. This conflict between nationalism and globalization is very important, because the result of this was that the international today has become irrelevant, truly irrelevant, the old international system. There's a new world that's coming into being. Look at the EU. The EU is not able to bring anybody together. Even the UN, we don't hear anything about what's coming out of the Arab Union, the African Union. All of these international organizations have proven to be completely irrelevant to the minds and the hearts of the people. Governments have taken control of that their own selves. But which governments are doing what? That's the question. In the Middle East here, just to come back a bit to the Middle East, we are cursed with so many crises before Corona. You know, Yemen is a crisis, Syria is a crisis, Iraq is a crisis, Libya is a crisis. All of this happened in the last few years. Then Corona came on top, and then we had the explosion in Lebanon, if you remember all. All of this came on top of each other. It came, I would say, as a pretext for a big change that's going to happen in our part of the world. And the change in our part of the world is going to change the entire world altogether, because the Middle East has always been the center of so many things in the world. And I am here to say that I'm expecting a new Arab Spring in the region. People are getting completely fed up of everything, anything that the government does. No government is coordinating with another government. The international system has to be rebuilt right from the start, one brick on top of the other, from bottom up. That's how the international system would work. But that can only happen when governments are changed, when governments are altered. Unfortunately, just for your info, most of the Arab world, the word democracy is a word used just as a token expression. Many parts of the Arab world now are suffering under a lot of lack of freedom, lack of choices. That has come on top of the Corona thing, which has created so much of the economic hardships now that will evolve definitely. I'm sure about it. I've been predicting this for a while, into a new Arab Spring. Now that's not the end of it. That's the beginning of something good. It has to get worse before it gets better. That's my idea. And the Arab world is getting to that point. It's a point of explosion. But that explosion was necessary. The environment was healing. The political systems were healing. Human rights were healing. Everybody was shouting. And now it's time for us to act. Now, what the Vice Chancellor said is absolutely correct. There is this now tension between globalization as we know it before Corona and nationalism. It looks like every country is on its own. Every country is taking decisions on its own. And people are following that to a certain extent. In Jordan here, for example, everybody started supporting the government and praising it for its efforts. Now they're all saying, what have you done to us? It's becoming a disaster. So that's a fatality. That's something that's going to happen whether we like it or not. That's the situation in the Arab world. Now, if it's to Africa, for example, the Arab world also is a place where we used to attract about 6 or 7% of the world tourism. But there was very little inter-Arab, inter-Middle East travel and tourism. Now, what we're suggesting here is a very simple thing. We need to do 3 steps. Step number 1 is keep facilities alive. We have to keep airlines alive. We have to keep hotels alive. We have to keep tour operators alive. That is done by pumping in some money, either in terms of loans, grants, or whatever it is, because that's the only way you can keep the energy going. But the second point, we have to move after that immediately to domestic and regional tourism. That's the second point. Third point, then you go to international tourism. You can't jump to international tourism directly. That's my second point I want to go. Domestic and regional tourism is very, very important. Now, why is it important? It's important not just because it is the only way out now, the only way to start. It's important because it is a principle, matter of principle, can be or should be enjoyed by any foreigner. If it's not enjoyed first by its own people. I completely believe in this. Our people have not known our country. We deal with tourists. When we say tourists, we think of a blonde person with blue eyes coming from Europe or from the United States, coming and jumping on us. We treat him like God on earth. That's not right. Our people should enjoy the country first. People should know their country, take pride in it. In Europe and in the US, 70 to 75% of tourism is already domestic tourism. That's a healthier way of getting started. In the developing world, unfortunately, it's not the case. It's not the case in Africa, it's not the case in the Middle East, it's not the case in South America, it's not the case in Asia as well. So, the issue of domestic tourism is a very important issue to us. I'm now working with ATB, Africa Tourism Board, on trying to promote this concept of domestic tourism through a project called Project Hope. Project Hope is a project that could be applied anywhere. I've written some papers to the government of Pakistan, to the government of Egypt, the government of Morocco, to try and adjust Project Hope to their needs. Because each government now will have to be dealt independently. You can't work with any national or regional organization anymore. They don't lead you anywhere, unfortunately. It's a fact. How do we go about this? We do need to rally around us some of the people that are conscious and aware of the changes that are happening in the world. This coronavirus has triggered so many forces within us. Some of these forces are going to turn up to be forces. Some of them are devastating for the time being, I know that. But eventually, a world change is happening. A new world order is being in the shape. The Arab world is in the middle of it. And it's going to be the heart and the core of all of it. Because what happened here in Jordan, for example, is after the praise that has been given to government for dealing with COVID. We only had 11 or 12 deaths initially. It was like no more than 300, 400 cases. Today they're in the hundreds, in the thousands. The cases are in the thousands and the deaths are in the hundreds. Why is that? Because this is not the right way to go about it. The more democratic the government is, the less capable it becomes to deal with a crisis like this. So autocrats and more authoritarian regimes were able to impose what they wanted to impose. But the time came now to say, enough is enough. We need to live. Life is not only about staying alive, it's the quality of life that matters. People are saying this all over. Even the way the world opened was a very strange way. But suddenly, from quarantines, from lockdowns, suddenly in 24 hours we found everybody opening up. They opened up in a very chaotic way because there is no experience in this. There is no mandate given to them by the people, no consultations, no circles to work out together. That's why we have to now get back to the basics, to the roots, rebuild the international system from the start. I'm with Professor Vice Chancellor in this summit idea, but summit of who? And to do what? I would not work within the UN system now. I'd work outside of it. I'd not work within the European system now. I'd work outside of it. I would really do something completely different from all that. And it's not just about tourism, it's about life now. It's not just the ministers of tourism, Professor Lee. Although I agree with much all of what you said, but it's about us going out and building foundations for a new world. This is what the world is all about. In Africa, through Africa Tourism Board, we have created something called Project Hope, about using tourism as a vehicle for better life. It's not about tourism only, it's about life. And this Project Hope is suggesting that each country must allocate 10% of its GDP to try and deal with this crisis. 1/3 of that should go directly to dealing with the comment phase, to try and keep businesses alive, keep facilities alive. But 2/3 of that must go into other projects. When you have a crisis, you don't make it tougher on people. You spend more money, even if you have to borrow it. If you have it under reserves, that's better. If you don't have it under reserves, you borrow it. I'm suggesting that every country would borrow 2/3 of that amount of money and spend it on projects. Remember in 1929, 28, 29, the United States built all its highways in the middle of the crisis, because that was the only way Roosevelt thought that the economy could revive, and he was right about it. Now, what this crisis is revealing is something different in geo. All the big powers of the world are shaking now, including the United States. And everything will have to be rethought from the beginning. It's time for us to think of a fairer world, more equitable world, and a world that is fair and just to everybody, not a world that is dominated only. I want to go back to the issue of domestic tourism, if you please, because domestic tourism is very, very important. I know it does not bring in any hard currency, it does not contribute to the balance of trade, but it does keep facilities alive and does keep jobs alive. And it's very, very important to build a national consensus about what's country all about before we invite any foreigner to come from outside, because they will come and see what they want to come and experience the people, not just the place. Then the world can come and say, I have the best country, I have the best mountains, I have the best rivers, I have the most beautiful beaches in the world. But no country can say, I have the people of Jamaica, or the people of the Bahamas, or the people of Jordan, or the people of Africa. The people are the most important part in any attraction, in any destination. And it's the people, these people have to get to know what they're talking about. But to revive domestic tourism, you have to think in a different way, to think outside of the box. The frame has to be different. You have to think of what are the needs of your local people. Our local people, for example, are not very much interested sometimes in some of the things that foreigners are interested in, tourist foreigners. So you have to think of families going out. What do they need? The product has to be different. The tour operators have to think differently. This is part of being able to survive this crisis for the tourism sector. You have to do this before you start thinking of international tourists. In Project Hope, we have identified 4 main areas to move forward into. One is domestic tourism, which I spoke about. 2 is technology, digital technology in particular. The world is changing also in this sense. Everything is becoming virtual. I had my daughter marry last week virtually. I'm in Amman, Jordan now. My daughter is in Dubai, and she was there with her husband. I was here in Amman with the father of the groom, and the priest was on the 3rd line. We got them married. This is the new life. It's not going to be just about meetings like this. Who thought we would be able to meet like this a few months ago? But we are meeting and we are interacting. We need to utilize digital technology to its best maximum, and we're doing that. And to do that, we need to invest much more into making sure that this technology is available to everybody. Every remote village in Africa, every remote village in the Middle East, South America, or Southeast Asia, India, all of these places. We have to start working like that. That's the second point. The third point is safety and security. Somebody said something which is very correct. I forgot who it was at the beginning of this meeting. He said, we still remember the day when we used to take off from our cars, carry our luggage and go directly into the plane. No metal detectors, no taking off your shoes, no taking off your belts. Today, this has become a way of life. Now, wearing a mask, like Ambassador Do said, and keeping a social distance, and using this sign for saying hello instead of shaking hand or hugging or kissing is going to be the new norm. It's going to be a way of life that's different. Safety and security must be observed to its maximum because that's the way our life is going to be all about. Now, Korea, I'm very fond of Koreans. You know, even before COVID, when I visited Korea, usually, you don't enter any house before taking off your shoes. If you're coughing, you have to wear a mask. Mask is not just a luxury thing that you wear it just when it's really crucial or when the government instructs you to. It's a way of life. Even the way they say hello, they don't shake hands, they just go like this, which is much more effective. So successful in going about dealing with this crisis. That's what I want to say for the time being. I'm open for questions and answers. I'm very, very excited about all what I heard, and I hope to be able to get some of these copies of these documents to look into them again. Thank you so much again, Mr. Bartlett, for bringing us together. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fai. So we're now at the, and thank you for your insightful, impactful, and heartfelt presentation. We are now at the section of the forum that we're going to ask the panelists to respond to questions that have been coming in through our social media platforms. Unfortunately, we can't ask all of these questions because I'm actually seeing over 30 questions. So I'll pick up ones that I think are that I've seen repeating in different ways, controversial or otherwise. This particular question is one that has been coming in from several persons, and I'm throwing it out to anyone to actually answer. The question is, given the many different vaccines that are being manufactured for distribution around the world, and the lack of any specific global leadership as it relates to managing the coronavirus, who do we trust, and who should we trust, and why should we trust this particular country or company?
About this, Professor. May I say something? Professor?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. I think our waiting for the vaccine is a useless wait. I think the vaccine is a big, big thing that all the politicians are now rallying around. It's become a political issue. It's not anymore a medical issue. I think testing is by far much more effective than the vaccine. Even if vaccine is approved now and verified, I will not vaccine myself. Vaccinating means just, it's a prevention measure. What we should concentrating on is testing and treatment. Treatment is much more effective than vaccine. So I don't think we should trust any of these games that are being played now. Everyone wants to score a point. Say the vaccine is the solution. Vaccine is just a matter of injecting some of these germs inside your body to make your body more resilient. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Afai. Do we have a response from anyone else? Sorry.
Shall I chip in here?
Prof. Miles. So we'll take Prof. Miles and then we'll take Prof. Congo. Prof. Miles?
Yeah, just to reinforce the point, if I start with as I'm the European person here, clearly the vaccine issue is in many ways being used as a kind of holy grail for politicians in that sense, and it tends to reinforce this narrative about that the pandemics are effectively self-contained issues and there will be an eventual medical solution. But from my perspective in the presentation, I put that there is some validity in that, of course, but it assumes in many ways that the COVID-19 scenario is a static one. We know that this is I'm not a medic, but a mutating virus. It comes from a mutating viral group, and effectively has brought in a new kind of strain into it. And the strains are multiplicating over time. And that means we're in many ways, vaccines are always in a kind of catch-up scenario. So we are very much in the early days of this. So in practice, to reinforce the point, we're going to need a much greater focus on testing and tracing rather than necessarily on vaccine immunization. And of course, the other important point that's very stressful is about the non-compliance issue, which of course Dr. Talib was talking about to some extent, which is actually about the costs imposition and non-compliance of parts of the population to be able to achieve that. So it's going to be a longer term issue, I think, in that sense. So we have time to wait and see. Of course, the first to get to the market will most likely be those that will make the most money out of vaccines, as we well know. And of course, there is a financial imperative. But here comes the point we've made strongly across the parallel, that the global norms and the global management of the use of how and when vaccines should be used will become as integrally important. We've had lots of solutions for malaria, for Ebola, for long periods of time, and yet in parts of the world we still have major problems with those. So here's an illustration that we need an integrated, holistic approach where the focus on the national level and on subnational solutions, which is what we move to very strongly, and need also for the global level to sort of catch up. We have that partly through the WHO, but of course it's all going to be instrumental for the travel and tourism sector. So waiting for a vaccine to solve the problem for travel and tourism is in many ways looking for the holy grail and probably a misplaced strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Miles. Professor Congo, I see you had something to say as well.
Yeah, thank you. I know that's quite a controversial issue, but I think that all of us, what we should be able to do, just like in the past, we have strategies of developing vaccines. And we know that some of the most serious diseases have been able to be controlled because the proper vaccine has come up. And therefore, to me, I think we should leave it to the World Health Organization to lead in the development of coming up with a proper vaccine. And as Professor has said, now it is more or less like competing of who is going to come up with the first one. We know it, there is politics, and there is also the financial part of it. And so this one makes us to be very, very, we need to be very careful with whoever is saying that is coming up with a vaccine.
Thank you very much, Prof. Congo. The second question, and I think I'm seeing several questions about this. How and in what ways have the internal politics of the United States affected the coronavirus spread, coronavirus management, and how have both impacted on the tourism sector? I'll ask Professor Beckles. I don't know if Professor Beckles is still on. No? Okay. Professor Miles, we'll lead off with you again.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and if I may phrase, one hell of a question in a sense, because as we well know, as part of any integrated approach, the role of the United States is going to be central to the way we look at the future of the COVID-19 and the travel and tourism. And in a sense, as we would expect it, and the issues around leadership in this area have been highly problematic. Firstly, of course, the America First strategy of the existing president means in practice it's quite open that it's going to be a more domestically orientated, a more insular approach that's going to be taken. And therefore waiting for the United States administration really to engage in those international leadership in the way that it may have done in the past may be a long wait. So I think in a sense what we need to recognise is where a United States policy is. We also need to look at where there's best practice in the United States and where there have been major mistakes have been made. And as in Europe, without being too controversial, it's a very, very mixed picture, to say the least, about what kind of platform on which the United States can lead on. But it is a central player. And of course, as a travel and tourism market, if we go for that implication, it's also a very important one, both in terms of providing a market and also in terms of technological procurement and in providing solutions. But I think we just have to have a realistic policy or a realistic awareness, which the world I think has already started to develop, that in the COVID-19 area, like many others, the United States is perhaps not going to provide the leadership as a global player that it has perhaps done in the past, or more accurately, maybe more controversial to many other partners across the world, and therefore it will be a very mixed picture. And it's understanding that a realism that I think is the key, rather than necessarily an expectation that the United States will play all the roles that it may have done in the past in relation to that. And my final point really, of course, is that it's not the only key player. And of course, China has been at the centre of many of these debates, both now and in the future, as the ambassador talked about. So in many ways, we have a more multipolar world in which we also need to be realistic about their role as well. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Waller. My comment would be within the context of acknowledging that in any major country, there will be several discourses taking place simultaneously, and these discourses all interact so that one discourse might very well suppress another. And in the USA at the moment, there is a major cultural debate between the power of science and technology on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cultural war around white supremacy and all of the related issues. So on the one hand, they have all the science. They have wonderful scientific universities. They have great laboratories. They have arguably one of the finest scientific communities in the world gathered in the country, and that is concentrated there in the higher education sector. But on the other hand, it's a society that is also fighting a very backward and primitive war about white supremacy and the refusal to allow the nation to evolve into its multiracial, multicultural matrix that is inevitable. So these battles are being fought, and in comes the COVID. In comes the COVID in the middle of this cultural war. And what does it do? It devastates the poor people. It devastates the poor people, most of whom are black people, Asian people, Middle Eastern people, people of color, people who are in the margins of the economy, at the base of the society, and it devastates that community. The result of that, I think many people have said, that is precisely because of this, that there wasn't an agility and an alacrity in response to this, so that by suppressing the science, which is part of the broader concept, they end up in this mess. This point is connected to the earlier question which was raised. Remember how there was this tremendous anxiety around the HIV virus and how it was affecting people 15, 20 years ago. And on the one hand, there was this great search for the vaccine. There was vaccine mania and all of that. And then in the end, they came to realize that it isn't the vaccine that is going to drive this, is going to contain, it is going to be teaching people civic responsibility, how to take care of yourselves, how to interact with your fellow human being, how at the moment of intimacy you take care of each other. That was where the conversation had to shift. And we forgot really who was going to make the money out of the HIV medication. What happened was a global movement said, no, 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 this is disproportionately destroying the lives of poor people, people who have been at the base of the society, not having the best nutrition, people whose immune systems are easily compromised. And I think we now have a great sense of common sense around how to treat that particular virus and how it spread. And I suspect a similar thing is going to happen with the COVID-19. The world is going to come to realize that they cannot focus on this obsession with vaccine, though it is driven by fear of death, fear of the quantitative dimension of the dying and the loss of life in the families and so on. That will continue to drive some measure of anxiety. But the United States is going to have to find a moral center that is based on education, that is based on what is democracy, what is justice for everyone, and how to treat society holistically as opposed to this major divide as to the kind of society you want. And if you want this kind of society that gives privileges to a few, then you will fight every strategy that takes care of the majority. And I think this is where COVID-19 had entered the US, and it has neutralized them, quite frankly. Their own internal political war and cultural war has neutralized their capacity to move. Now, in the Caribbean, of course, we are trapped between the North America ineffectiveness and the Brazilian crisis that has similar roots. Brazil is going through the same kind of internal political discourses as the USA about race and class and distribution and poverty and who has the right, and the notion of social justice versus economic empowerment for the elite versus social justice for the majority. Brazil is having the same conversation that the USA is having, and both of them have found themselves unable to provide leadership in this circumstance. So the answer to the question is that a country's capacity to manage a pandemic has a great deal to do with the state of political discourses and cultural discourses that are dominant in the political environment.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Prof. Beckles. Dr. Rafai or Prof. You want to, Prof. Congo, you have something to say?
Just want to say that
I thought I saw your hands up a while ago. You're indicating that you wanted to speak. All right, we can move to the next question then. The United Nations, so this is the final question actually. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Talib. Talib, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say it's all about leadership. It's the leadership that is making a difference in each and every country. It's down to the bottom line. And COVID has come exactly like the professor just said, to uncover some of the weaknesses that society has been suffering from before that to start with. So I would really boil it down to one word: leadership. What is leadership doing there? And how is the situation before COVID that led into that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so our final question is that the United Nations General Assembly is seeking to have its 31st session on COVID-19. What are the critical tourism, travel and tourism related issues that you think should be put on the table for countries to discuss and for the UN to take action on? We can start with Prof. Congo.
Yeah, thank you for that question. But maybe going back to the earlier question about the aspect of USA and China, I tend to think that the biggest challenge that we are having today, we know in the past, USA has been playing a major role in guiding the world when it comes to solving some of the crises. A good example is when we had the Ebola outbreak in West Africa a few years ago. And we saw how President Obama was able to mobilize the whole world. And within no time, that problem of Ebola never became such a big epidemic as we are having today. The biggest challenge now we are having is that USA is absconding to the law that it has been praying for many years. And China is trying to fit in. Unfortunately, it seems that the shoes are too big for China, although it's trying. But I tend to think that, as the area presenter said, all this has to do with the readership. I think readership play a very, very significant role. When it comes to the issue that need to be raised during the coming meeting of the UN, as far as the issue for tourism is concerned, I tend to think that mentioned area, we know that tourism, it talk about the freedom of movement. But now we are seeing cases where now countries, they have put restrictions where sometimes some countries, if you go, then what is happening, you have to be put in a quarantine for 14 days. And therefore it means that very few people can be able to say that they are going for a tour, knowing that I arrive in that particular country, I'll be put in quarantine for 14 days. I saw a case in Britain when tourists were to visit, I think it was either Spain or Portugal. And you realize that by doing that, you discourage so much people from going to these countries. So to me, I think we need to look at the country policies. It's true. We need to take care of the people who are visiting other countries. Are these people infected? If they are not infected, then we need to find a way of, if somebody is tested and he is not positive, he is negative, then we need to come up with policies that these people then can be allowed to travel. So the aspect of policy becomes very important as far as traveling is concerned. And this is something that needs to be discussed at the UN level. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Congo. Prof. Beckles, actually, this question about the special session, I threw it out to everyone, but it was specific to you as it relates to how the Caribbean, what are the issues in the Caribbean that should be put on the table?
Well, I do believe that the Caribbean has this very special responsibility at this stage and moving this conversation forward. As I said, the Caribbean is in the deepest end, not only of the issue of climate change and how it interlocks now with COVID and the impact on the existential survival of these islands. And given the fact that these islands have been the most globalized islands in the world over 500 years, it is here that Columbus first came. And when he came, he unleashed all kinds of global forces on these islands. And now, of course, as a result of industrialization in Europe, we now have, and elsewhere, again, the islands are at the center of rising sea levels, global temperatures, and so on. So the islands have a long pedigree of dealing with some of the worst disasters in the world, having to deal with slavery, with colonization, with the downside of viruses, climate change, chronic diseases. I mean, that has been our burden. So I think we have a responsibility to say, listen, tourism is going to be about freedom of the human being to move across this world as they have done from the time of, based on your science or your religion, from time immemorial. Humans have moved, viruses have moved, movement has been the constant. We in the Caribbean needs to say that this industry on which we are totally dependent for our economic survival, this industry can only survive and thrive on the basis of a sense of freedom, of a sense of civility, tolerance, and a new format of engaging the people where you travel into. You don't just go onto the beaches and lie down in the sun and go home. You go into the society, you meet the people, you learn their food, you learn their ecosystem, you learn their sports, you learn their entertainment, and you participate holistically. We need global peace for this to happen. We need to have tolerance and peace in the world for us in the Caribbean and for tourism generally in all parts of the world to thrive. And as we heard from Miles, the globalization has always had two dimensions to it. Yes, there is a narrative of the global playing field and the openness and the borderlessness. That conversation had always been a part of globalization. But at the same time, the nation state, national policy, national boundaries have always been the building block. And we are caught between the building blocks and the narrative. And the best way to negotiate this is through multilateral conversations. And I agree with Talib, I agree with Miles that we need to have a global conversation because globalization is split and splintered. We need to impose upon that reality a multilateral conversation about the economics of tourism, about the politics of global peace, of global tolerance, about the nature of humanity in general and the freedom it inspires. And tourism is precisely that. It's a freedom product, meaning I go beyond my boundaries and I feel free to engage, participate, to roam. I feel free to do all of these magnificent things and to keep doing it, not just do it once per life, but every year I do this. I do this every year. I want that freedom. So the multilateral conversation that interfaces the industry with the ideology of freedom, we need to put those two things together so that we can plan together. And I believe a summit, maybe we can break it up into hemispheric segments and then put it together because it's very difficult to put together a global conversation unless you use the instruments of the United Nations or its related bodies. I think maybe UNDP is a useful institution to force this. I'm quite sure from what I have heard, participating in the Sustainable Development Goals, that UNDP might be a very interesting place to bring this conversation together around the world so that we can look at tourism within the context of sustainable development for humanity. I think that is where we need to go, and I cannot think of a better person than Minister Bartlett, with all of his advocacy and his energy and the respect he enjoys, to be part of the leadership for this. Maybe we can forge a conversation with UNDP in the first instance, to have that conversation to see where we can go. But I think it is absolutely necessary.
Thank you very much, Prof. Beckles. Talib, Dr. Fai, or Dr. Miles? I see Prof. Miles, I see Lee here dying to say something.
Yep.
Go ahead, Prof.
Please go ahead, Miles. Go ahead.
Are you sure, Talib? Yeah, I wanted to reinforce a couple of points, actually, and agree with the Vice-Chancellor on a couple of points. If you were to ask me what are the issues that which was the session should consider, well, I think firstly it starts off with this fundamental point that we really are moving beyond seeing COVID-19 as a crisis, but really more as a sustainable development long-term issue. And therefore, that narrative needs to move into that domain, and it really builds upon what the Vice-Chancellor was talking about here, about how we build synergies and linkages. And that means in practice that we need to think about it in that particular way. I would also, so I would argue, in a sense, we need to reconnect, if you like, away, and I'm a crisis management disaster professor, away from seeing it as a purely one-dimensional crisis to effectively a sustainable development question about how we deal with effectively a travel and tourism sector and development in a more challenging COVID-19 world, in which there is, as the point was made by Minister Bartlett, a shared regional capacity in a globalised space. So in that sense, I think that's the important point. The second, that leads to 2 points. It leads to the next point, which is really that the travel and tourism debate needs to move into, well, how do we promote freedom when we will also have to accept restrictions on freedom of movement of people? And in many ways, actually moving that debate about, when the EU context would have been the 4 freedoms of free movement of persons, capital, services, and goods. Well, actually, in the COVID scenario, it affects all. But for travel and tourism, the free movement of people question is fundamentally important. So really, are we needing to really reinterpret our expectation and our discourse around what travel and tourism does and what it can provide? And that is that needs to, so getting back to the grassroots that we talk about what freedom means, as the Vice-Chancellor talked about here. But as part of that sustainable development question, I suspect it also means we need to really try to reconnect through maybe these regional debates that the Vice-Chancellor is talking about, these regional blocks, the developed world, first world experience of insularity in Europe and in the United States, of dealing with crises in their own backyard of a pandemic, which in many ways they have had to deal with for a long time, with actually the connections with the developing world, where those debates need to be reconnected and shared again. And travel and tourism had been a way through the redistribution of wealth to be able to deal with that. It had been one way where movement and money had moved. But actually that requires also solutions about what we mean in my next point, which is how we talk about resilience and what we mean by a resilience part of this new sustainable development for travel and tourism. And I'll end with one final point, which is actually we traditionally have seen the private sector as a growth sector. And what COVID had done is really changed the narrative slightly around travel and tourism, not just necessarily being seen as a growth sector in the short term, but one really driven by private enterprise. Here we're talking about that state solutions and the state frameworks that Minister Bartlett and Talib and the Vice-Chancellor have talked about are fundamental to actually maintaining that. So what do we mean by a new definition of public and private partnerships in this new shared COVID environment for travel and tourism? For me, it's that level of debate that needs to be taken back into the global area about those norms, which then allows the best practice, which has developed in certain states and in certain experiences and in the Caribbean regional context, to be brought to the fore and for everybody to learn from. So it's all of that kind of issue about moving the agenda to a new narrative around different types of terms of reference, which are not just affirmed by the notion of crisis, but as Talib talked about, of opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Miles. I am now going to ask Minister Bartlett to briefly respond to the lectures and the questions and their responses. Minister Bartlett?
Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Waller. I think that this is the most difficult position that I've ever been placed in all my years in the public space, and particularly to be able to respond to this really treasure trove of great ideas and enormous guidance that the world has gotten today from this rich outpouring from this most eminent panel. I must tell you that the gems that have picked up from it are so numerous. I was trying to scribble down some of them, and perhaps I might just want to indicate that what resonates heavily at the end of all of this discussion was a note also from Professor Congo, which essentially says that we have seen the light at the end of the tunnel for COVID-19. And that light is in dialogue, it's in discussion, it's in collaboration. It's in getting the world to speak more about what is happening, to share ideas, to look at the scientific and technological advances that are here, but also to bring a level of equity to the whole process, to ensure that what the outcomes are in terms of the values for us are shared and shared equally. The rich, large countries and the small, poor countries must have equal access to the outcome of technology and the approaches that we're making to solving this problem. But I think in the middle of all of that, tourism is inserted, and it's inserted as the great equalizer. It's positioning itself as the node that drives freedom, that enables societies to interact and to find recourse in the values of themselves, the richness of their culture, the diversity that exists, and the capacity for us to tolerate. And I like that one, that we're creating a new norm, that tourism now is offering to the world an opportunity for us to appreciate that the way forward is about respect and tolerance. Professor Beckles, I thought, really was insightful this morning and has put a lot of challenges out there for us, one of which is this global dialogue, which he wants on the way forward. And I believe that we at the center want to be part of that. As a matter of fact, I'm humbled by the suggestion he makes that I could lead such a process. And indeed, the center, Talib, we will look at that carefully. I think in this very same series that we're doing, perhaps the fifth of the series could very well relate to that global dialogue. But also the issue of looking at the global multilateral agencies that exist and how we can partner and how we could share in building out possibilities for a stronger global response. And the UNDP, Professor Miles, is indeed an avenue that I think we can look at together. Professor Congo and the relationship with Kenya and the Kenyatta University is a strong and powerful one. And we are delighted of the work that you're doing over there and in enabling us to spread the message strong and to enable the continent of Africa to have a deeper sense of what the solutions can be and how we can coalesce around some common ideas in getting these results. I want to also use the opportunity to indicate our sense of support for the Global Resilience Council and the work that that team is doing, not just in Europe, but all across the world. It is indeed a confluence of ideas and will that's going to drive the development of new ideas, new forms, new systems, new methods, and new processes that will help to take tourism back to where it should be and to get the world to understand the importance of this great freedom-driving product. And I like that term. I think that Professor Beckles coined that one for us. that tourism is a freedom product. And we would like to market that strongly globally as that product which is going to enable the world to come back to itself after COVID-19. So finally, I want to pick out another gem from this great debate this morning, which says that what we now need to do is to determine the new global norm in an endemic COVID world. Professor Miles, was that yours? I think it was, yes. And we'd like to leave with that one, Prof, that yes, that's the mission, to now determine a new global norm in an endemic COVID world. I want to thank the team. I'm really very proud to be part of this morning, and I really want to establish the fact that the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center put together this dialogue, this discussion, and that essentially all the participants are members of the board, and the board is consisting of a global representation. Every continent on earth is represented on the board of this global center. Thank you all, and bless you.
Thank you very much, Minister Bartlett. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kerry Wallace, the Executive Director of the Tourism Enhancement Fund here at the Ministry of Tourism, for the vote of thanks. But before Dr. Wallace, I'd like to just personally thank the panelists for finding this two and a half hours to make this particular presentation. It was very insightful and extremely substantive. As a matter of fact, the number of questions that we've been getting and comments about all of what they've learned today, it's phenomenal. I'd also like to thank the presenters. Sorry, one second, please. Okay, I'd also like to thank those of you who took time out to watch this particular event. This is a part of the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center mandate as it relates to keeping persons informed, making persons more aware of different aspects of tourism. And although this was a controversial discussion, I think the outcome has been phenomenal as it relates to the knowledge that many of us have gained from this event. I'd also like to thank the organizers. Interestingly so, this event was organized by 17 persons residing in 9 countries around the world, different time zones, on a WhatsApp group, and it was getting it together was a Herculean task, but we managed to get it so. And as it relates to our participants, I just realized that we had over 2,000 persons watching at a particular point for this event. So it just goes to show the interest in this particular topic. And finally, I'd like to thank Laurie Myers from the Jacob Media Group, from the who is also a part of the Resilience Council, for her hard work in terms of promoting the event. I don't think Laurie sleeps, but that's a conversation for another day. Dr. Wallace, over to you.
Thank you. Well, between yourself and Chairman Bartlett, you've covered a lot of the persons that deserve the thanks for this outstanding summit that we had today, the 4th in the lecture series at the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center. The panelists that was a repository of knowledge, and they shared their wisdom with us, and I believe it will be a catalyst for many great things to come as we recover stronger from this pandemic that has hit the globe. I want to therefore spend a lot of my time thanking the persons who wouldn't be able to thank themselves. So Minister Bartlett, for not just conceptualizing this summit, but the lecture series overall. Not just that, but the Global Tourism and Resilience Crisis and Management Center as a necessary organization to combat this pandemic, but future pandemics or anything that can pose a threat to tourism on a global level. And it's quite timely, and we see the impact of it in today's summit and the success that it has had. To the moderator, Professor Waller, for coordinating as well. He is also the executive director of the Crisis Management Center, and so I'd like to thank him as well too. The others who have made this day possible, including the Tourism Enhancement Fund for providing some of the support as well, the Tourism Linkages Network, and we heard from our head of the Knowledge Network, Omar Robinson. I'd like to thank you as well. Most importantly, I'd like to thank the participants who were here, those who also submitted questions. It is a collective effort that will get the solutions for this challenge that the world is facing. And so we are very encouraged when we see the level of participation from you who were watching today. So thanks to everyone, and we look forward to more lecture series coming, and we look forward to a lot of the recommendations from this summit implemented in the near future.
Press that one there.